Hello, everybody. I am K. Ashok Vardhan Shetty, a former IAS officer of Tamil Nadu cadre and a former Vice Chancellor of a central university called the Indian Maritime University, Chennai. Each year, in the General Studies paper 4 of the Civil Services Mains Examination, there are 6 case studies questions in ethics, integrity and aptitude, carrying a total of 120 marks. Many candidates find them very difficult, but according to me, case studies are the easiest part of the civil services examination. For every other part of the syllabus, you will have to do an enormous amount of reading. You will also be required to remember countless facts, figures, and formulas. While solving case studies questions, you will be required to think on your feet, or rather, to think on your seat, and also to write the answers in your own words. Most of us who have been through the Indian school and college system are used to memorizing and reproducing answers verbatim from the textbooks. We are not very comfortable with thinking on our seat or with writing answers in our own words. When we are faced with a new or unfamiliar question, we tend to panic. That's why many candidates find case studies questions rather difficult. In the course of my lectures, I will help you overcome these mental barriers and also teach you new methods of thinking. I will also be solving all the case studies questions that were asked between 2013 and 2019. While solving them, I will teach you how to identify the various types of case studies and how to apply the appropriate method or technique for each type. Once you have mastered these methods, answering case studies questions should be a breeze. If you follow my lecture and apply my methods diligently, I am confident that you will be able to secure 60 to 90 marks out of 120 in the case studies questions. By the Civil Services Mains Examination standards, that's a very good mark indeed. I would like to introduce to you 2 new concepts in thinking: convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking assumes that a question has only one right answer and that a problem has a single solution. What is 5 multiplied by 5? 25. There is only one right answer. Who discovered the theory of relativity? Albert Einstein. Only one right answer. Who wrote Tirukkural? The sage Thiruvalluvar. Again, only one right answer. Our educational system has conditioned us to believe that there is only one correct answer to every question. Even when we solve multiple choice questions with 4 or 5 options, we are doing convergent thinking when we tick the right answer or what we think is the right answer. But the real world has many problems which do not have any one correct answer. Various alternative answers may be equally plausible, or a problem may have a range of answers with varying degrees of correctness. One answer may be 60% correct, another answer may be 80% correct, and so on. People used to convergent thinking find this kind of thinking uncomfortable. Case studies questions are of this kind. Most of them do not have any one correct answer. Several alternative answers are possible. You are expected to think laterally, to come up with original, unexpected, or unusual ideas. It is how you justify your case which matters. This calls for an entirely different set of thinking skills called divergent thinking. Divergent thinking seeks multiple perspectives and multiple possible answers to questions and problems. Let me illustrate the concept of divergent thinking by asking you to come up with 25 alternative uses for a brick. When I pose this question to a group of over 100 students in a classroom, collectively they took nearly 15 minutes to come up with 25 alternate uses for a brick. This shows that most of us are not comfortable with divergent thinking. In an examination scenario, you have only limited time to come up with a range of options for a case study question. So you need to cultivate and hone your faculty of divergent thinking. Now coming to the brick example, the first and the most common use of a brick, of course, is as a building material in construction of buildings. Let me quickly list 24 other alternative uses for a brick. As a weapon to whack somebody, as a projectile to throw at somebody, to kill a cockroach or any other bug, as a paperweight, to hold down sheets of plastic or cloth, to keep balloons tethered so that they don't float away, as a door stop, as a vehicle stop, to mark the boundaries of a plot. Crushed bricks can be used as one of the ingredients of concrete. Bricks can be used to pave a muddy road. A brick can be used to write something on a wall. A brick can be used to scrub a buffalo. A brick can be used to scrub paint from a wall. It can be used to make a garden bench, to make a tree guard, to make a fireplace. You can use finely crushed brick powder to brush your teeth. You can color pieces of brick and make a work of art. You can use a brick as a hammer to drive a nail. A piece of brick may be used to prevent a table from wobbling. A brick can be used as a heat insulating lining. You can use a brick to draw a straight line or a right angle. You can use a brick as a holder for fireworks. You will notice that we really let our imagination soar as we thought of the various alternative uses for a brick. Let me pose another problem to you in divergent thinking. Think of 25 different uses for a paperclip. Convergent thinking applies logic to a large number of facts and figures to determine the correct answer. Divergent thinking uses imagination to generate a large number of alternative ideas, including original, unexpected, or unusual ideas. Now suppose that you are a writer of short stories or novels. How do you come up with a narrative? You have to use your imagination. The same is true if you are an artist, a sculptor, a scientist, an inventor, a fashion designer, and so on. All these creative people tend to be divergent thinkers. So we associate divergent thinking with creativity. And as I said before, solving case studies questions calls for divergent thinking. The next two concepts in thinking that I would like to introduce to you are binary thinking and spectrum thinking. Binary means two. Binary arithmetic, which forms the basis of information and communication technologies, is based on two digits 0 and 1. You all know what a spectrum is. The spectrum of visible light consists of 7 colors: violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. The electromagnetic radiation spectrum, which exists in nature, ranges from radio waves to microwaves to infrared waves to visible light to ultraviolet radiation to X-rays to gamma rays. So spectrum is nature's way of expressing complexity. Now in binary thinking, even complex ideas and problems are overly simplified and only two sides or options are presented when there are actually many sides or options. Example, good or bad, right or wrong, intelligent or stupid, possible or impossible, etc. It is a black or white kind of thinking which ignores the many shades of grey in between. It is also called the either or fallacy. As human beings, we are conditioned to think in binary terms, to think in black or white terms, to think in extremes. If you take a person X, we tend to say either that X is a very good person or that X is a very bad person. The truth is that X is likely to have several positive qualities and several negative qualities. We need to weigh both together and form an overall opinion of X. The real world is complex and you cannot simplify it in binary terms. Spectrum thinking avoids simplifying assumptions and actively looks for complexity and gray areas. It considers multiple sides or options of an idea or a problem. Instead of just either or, it also considers both, neither, between, other, etc. While answering case studies, you must avoid simplistic yes or no types of answers. Instead, you must use your imagination to think of a range of alternative options and then discuss the pros and cons of each of them, accepting some of them while discarding others. In the initial years, the case studies questions themselves gave multiple options, but the candidates were still required to think of other innovative options. In recent years, the case studies questions don't give the alternative options. The candidates are required to come up with them on their own. For success in the civil services mains examination, time management is the key. You should know what to read, how much to read, and what to avoid. You may remember that I said that case studies questions require the least amount of reading and remembering. You may want to know what books, articles, or audio-visual materials that you should read or watch for the purpose of case studies. It may come as a surprise to you, but the subject that is nearest in relevance to the case studies is philosophy. Most of you will think that philosophy is a very dry and abstract subject, and you would be right. But you must also remember that ethics is a branch of philosophy, and the case studies that are asked are part of ethics. So it is important that you read some relevant books on ethics and see some audiovisual materials relating to ethics. Now, I would highly recommend that you see the 50 short videos on philosophy prepared by BBC Radio 4 and the Open University UK. Each video is about 1 to 2 minutes duration, so the 50 videos together will not take you more than 90 minutes. Now you may think that some of these videos are not relevant to you, but I would still advise you to see all of them, because what is needed is a training of the mind. I would also highly recommend that you see the 46 short videos in a website called Crash Course in Philosophy. Each video is slightly longer, about 9 to 10 minutes duration, but the 46 short videos together will take you about 8 hours. But these 8 hours are time well spent. So 1.5 plus 8, 9.5 hours, you'll need to spend about 10 hours watching these 96 short videos. And 10 hours is the amount of time that you typically spend reading in a day. I wouldn't advise you to read any textbooks on ethics or philosophy, but I would suggest that you should read these two books. These are books on popular ethics. One is Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, written by Michael Sandel. The second is Ethics in the Real World, written by Peter Singer. Now, Michael Sandel is a professor of philosophy in Harvard University, while Peter Singer is a professor of philosophy in Princeton University. Both these books are very easy to read. They are just about 200 to 300 pages long, and they contain a wealth of examples and cases which are similar to the kind of case studies questions that are asked in a civil services examination. If you have less than 6 months to go for your civil services mains examination, then perhaps you can skip reading these 2 books and focus entirely on watching the short videos of BBC Radio 4 and the Open University and the crash course in philosophy. But if you have more than 6 months' time, then I would highly recommend that you read both these books. You don't have to read them like textbooks. In fact, you should read them like any other non-fiction book. Read them once, but with rapt attention. It is quite possible that you will get your case studies questions from one of the cases that you studied in these books, but even if they don't, you should not be disappointed, because you should get over this mindset that that the questions asked will be from whatever you have studied. As I said earlier, you should be able to think on your feet, and the purpose of reading these books and watching these audiovisual materials is to train your mind to think in a particular way, a way that is suited for solving the case studies questions.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. Some utilitarians argue that the 2 cases are not importantly different from each other. Both have similar consequences, and consequences are all that really matter. In each case, 1 person dies and 5 are saved, the best option in each harrowing situation. But lots of people say they would switch the points, but they wouldn't push the man off the bridge. Are they simply inconsistent, or are they onto something?
I hope you liked this video. The trolley problem is a famous problem in ethics and doesn't have any easy solutions. Convergent thinkers and binary thinkers jump to simplistic solutions. They say, yes, let us pull the lever and sacrifice 1 person to save the lives of 5 persons. But matters are much more complex. We need to put on our divergent thinking cap and spectrum thinking cap and use our imagination to identify a range of other alternatives. First question is, can we really measure and weigh human lives? Can we say 5 lives are greater than 1? It's not a clear-cut answer. Second, it can be argued that the 5 people who are working on the main track, they know, or at least they should know, that a train may come along that track at any time. So it is quite possible that at the very last minute, they may see the onrushing train and jump off the track and save themselves. But if you pull the lever and divert the train to the utilitarian spur, the single man who is working there, he doesn't expect a train to come. So when it actually comes, he will be taken by surprise and he will most certainly die. So when you look at it this way, pulling the lever is not a good thing. Let me pose another question, pose another thought experiment. Suppose you are a healthy young man and you have been admitted to a hospital with a broken leg. While you are in the hospital, there are 5 other patients who are waiting for organ transplantation. One needs a heart, another needs a liver, third needs a lung, fourth needs a kidney, fifth needs eyes. Now, one of the doctors in the hospital says that you look like a healthy young man, why not kill you and harvest your organs to save the 5 patients who need organ transplantation? Would you agree to that? Most certainly no. So the question as to whether one life is greater or 5 lives are greater is not easy. There is no simple and direct answer to questions like this. Now, the trolley problem poses 2 philosophical questions. One is called ethical dilemma. That is, you are in a dilemma when you are faced with 2 options, both of which are equally unattractive. Whether to kill 5 people, whether to risk killing 5 people, or risk killing 1 person. It also poses another philosophical question, the ends versus means. Ends means goals or objectives. Means are the methods by which you attain those goals or objectives. Now, it is not enough if you have noble or correct goals and objectives. The means which you adopt to attain those goals and objectives must also be correct. Scoring high marks in an examination is a good aim, a good end, a good objective. But resorting to unfair means like copying is not correct. So you cannot engage in unfair means to achieve a noble end. Similarly, saving 5 lives may be a noble objective, but killing 1 innocent, unsuspecting man to save those 5 lives may not necessarily be the correct means to do it. There is a school of philosophy called utilitarianism, first propounded by Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher, and later expanded upon by John Stuart Mill, also an English philosopher. Now, the core of the idea of utilitarianism may be expressed in the phrase, the greatest good of the greatest number. Suppose there is a joint family of 5 brothers. A decision which favors just 1 brother over the other 4 may not be a popular decision. Ideally, a decision which benefits all the 5 brothers is excellent. A decision which benefits 4 brothers but is to the detriment of the 5th brother may be better. It's not as good as the first, but maybe better than a decision which benefits only 1 brother and is to the detriment of 4 brothers. Similarly, if you talk of government policies, a policy which benefits 85% of the population is surely better than a policy which benefits only 15% of the population. Or a policy which benefits all industries, big, medium, small, and cottage industries, is better than a policy which favors only a few big corporates. Now, you may say that this is mere common sense, but you will be surprised at the number of instances where an influential and vocal minority is able to make government policies benefit them to the detriment of the large majority. Now, utilitarianism as a principle is very sound. The principle of the greatest good of the greatest number is very sound, but utilitarianism also has exceptions, and the trolley problem is one of those exceptions. I will now move on to solving an actual case study question, namely question number 12 in General Studies paper 4 of 2015 mains examination. This is somewhat similar to the trolley problem in the sense that in both cases the underlying theme is prioritization of some lives over others. Now, a few general observations about how I will be solving case studies in the course of my lectures. First, I will be showing on the slide only a gist of the case study. For the full case study, you must refer to the particular question paper. You must read the case study not once but twice in order to understand the question properly. Second, there is a word limit of 250 words for answering a case study. In order to help you understand the various pros and cons, I will be discussing each case study elaborately. At the end of the discussion, I will be summarizing the key points. But even my summary may be much longer than 250 words. So I would advise you to note down the key points and practice writing your answer to each case study question in 250 words. Let me read out the gist of this case study from the slide. Floods and landslides, 1 lakh persons, locals as well as outsiders, trapped along different routes and locations. They include senior citizens, women and children, pilgrims, tourists, hikers, patients in hospitals, prisoners in jails, ruling party's regional president along with his family, additional chief secretary of a neighboring state, etc. The order in which you would rescue these people and why. Convergent thinkers and binary thinkers tend to give simplistic or pedestrian answers to this problem. For example, they may say, we will first save women and children for this and this reason. We will then save senior citizens for this and this reason. Now you will get very poor marks if you answer in this manner. Remember that there is no one correct answer to a case study question. What the examiner is looking for is how well you can analyze all the dimensions of the problem and whether you can come up with original or innovative solutions. So what would be a good innovative answer to this particular case study question? The first step to evacuation of the 1 lakh stranded persons is to do a disaster mapping. By this I mean you should try to get fairly accurate estimates of how many persons are stranded in each location and their breakup by category. That is, how many senior citizens, how many women, how many children, how many tourists, etc. For example, there may be 500 stranded persons in location A, 2,000 persons in location B, 10,000 persons in location C, and so on. Unless you have these figures, you will not be in a position to send the required number of vehicles, which should be buses and trucks, to each location to rescue the people. Assuming that 50 persons can get into a bus or a truck, you would need to send about 10 buses to location A, 40 buses to location B, and 200 buses to location C. So, disaster mapping and reasonably accurate estimation of the number of vehicles needed for each location is the crucial first step. The second step is to mobilize as many vehicles as required so as to evacuate all the 1 lakh stranded people in one go if possible. This will obviate the difficult task of prioritizing among different categories of persons, whom to save first, whom to save second, and so on. Let us for the moment ignore patients in hospitals and prisoners in jails whose numbers are not likely to be significant and who require special types of vehicles for their evacuation. To evacuate 1 lakh stranded persons, you would need about 2,000 buses or trucks in the aggregate. Mobilizing this many vehicles from within the district or from neighboring districts should not be too difficult. It can be done. If you can mobilize 2,000 vehicles, then the problem of prioritization is automatically solved. This is the way to go because all human lives are equally precious and equally sacrosanct. As far as possible, you should try to avoid the tricky problem of deciding whom to save first, whom to save second, and so on. In this connection, I would like to narrate to you the heroic story of the evacuation of 3 lakh British, French, and Indian troops stranded in Dunkirk during the Second World War. Dunkirk is a small port town on the north coast of France. In 1940, France fell, and the victorious German troops had surrounded and cornered 3 lakh British, French, and Indian troops in Dunkirk. They would have surely been killed or captured within a few days. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of UK, mounted a massive rescue operation. He mobilized all the naval ships, merchant ships, fishing vessels, and even private yachts and boats that he could muster. He sent them across the English Channel and managed to evacuate all the 3 lakh stranded troops from Dunkirk. My point in telling you this story is that you should, like Churchill, put in effort to mobilize as many vehicles as required, about 2,000 in this case, in order to evacuate all the 1 lakh stranded persons from all the locations in one go, so that you are saved from the bother of prioritizing the lives of one group of people over others. This is not to say that prioritization can be entirely avoided. For example, the floodwaters may be more dangerous in some locations than in others, and you may have to rush vehicles to these locations first. Or there may be mistakes in your estimation of the number of persons stranded in some of the locations. For example, 2,000 persons may be stranded in a location, but your information was that only 1,000 persons were stranded. So you sent only 20 buses or trucks where 40 were required. In such a situation, you will have no other option but to prioritize. You will have to tell the people that another 20 buses are on the way, and in the meantime, you will carry out evacuation as follows. Now, you need not treat senior citizens, women, children, pilgrims, hikers, tourists, etc. as separate categories just because the question says so. Nothing prevents you from clubbing 2 or more categories together to form a bigger category. For example, you can club senior citizens, women and children, and the VVIPs, if any, to form a bigger category of persons who will be evacuated first. This will be acceptable to most people. You may question the logic of including VVIPs in the first category. The ruling party's regional president and the additional chief secretary of a neighboring state would bring enormous pressure upon you to evacuate them first. And if you don't, they may go around bad-mouthing about you, saying that you are incompetent. And their words will be listened with some respect. As a thought experiment, suppose that Virat Kohli or A.R. Rahman are stranded in a location. Wouldn't you evacuate them on priority? You should, because they are very important persons. So as a matter of practical necessity, VVIPs should also be included in the first category of persons to be evacuated on priority, along with senior citizens, women, and children. The second category would include all other persons, excluding patients in hospitals and prisoners in jails. That is, it would include pilgrims, hikers, tourists, and all men, other than those coming in the first category. What I have stated before is the third step. The fourth step would be to make special arrangements for evacuating patients in hospitals and prisoners in jails. This need not be done in series, that is, after the other 3 steps are done, but should be done in parallel. Some of the patients in hospitals may be able to get onto a bus, but some others may need special vehicles such as ambulances. You need to get reasonably accurate information about this breakup. You will also have to mobilize the required number of ambulances from various sources, both government and private. You may also have to convert cars or vans into makeshift ambulances. Prisoners may need special police vans or buses with adequate armed guards, otherwise they may escape. So evacuation of these 2 categories is rather complicated, but the necessary arrangements will have to be made in parallel with the arrangements for evacuating 1 lakh stranded persons. An answer along these lines will impress the examiner and you will score high marks.
Let me summarize the answer. When I posed this problem to candidates, many of them give pedestrian, run-of-the-mill answers like saying we'll evacuate senior citizens first, followed by women and children, and so on. Now, this kind of an answer will not fetch you more than 4 marks out of 20. What the examiners expect of you is that you should think a problem through and come up with innovative solutions. I would suggest the following answer. The first step would be to do a disaster mapping
by which I mean to estimate as accurately as possible the number of people stranded in the various locations, along with a breakup. That is, how many of them are senior citizens, how many are women and children, how many are tourists, pilgrims, hikers, and so on. Unless you have this information, you are not in a position to mobilize the required number of vehicles, nor do you know how many vehicles to send to each location. So this is the crucial first step. The second step is to mobilize as many vehicles as are required so that all the stranded persons are rescued in one go, so that the tricky question of prioritizing between different categories of people is avoided. Let me explain. Supposing 1 lakh people are stranded, let us exclude for the time being patients in hospitals and prisoners in jails. To evacuate 1 lakh people, you will need about 2,000 buses or trucks, assuming you can pack about 50 people to a bus or a truck. So you need to mobilize in the aggregate 2,000 buses or trucks, which is not too difficult. In the district, in a district, you can do it, and if you can't find that many vehicles in your district, you can always procure them from neighboring districts. And if you are able to mobilize this number of vehicles, then there is no reason why you cannot evacuate all the people in one go, provided the information you have is reasonably accurate. Now, the third step would be that things don't always go according to plan. In 1 or 2 locations, the information may be wrong. For example, you might have been told that there are 1,000 stranded people in a particular location and you sent 20 buses, but it turns out that the information was wrong and there are actually 2,000 stranded persons and you require 40 buses. In such a situation, you will be required to prioritize. So what will you do? You will tell the people that 20 more buses are coming, but in the meantime, we will evacuate as follows. In the first category would be, you don't have to treat each of senior citizens, women and children as a separate category. You can have a bigger category, like the first bigger category would be senior citizens, women and children, and VVIPs. They will be the first category. They will be evacuated first. In the second category would come all others. That is, pilgrims, hikers, tourists, all men. Basically, all men will come in the second category. Now, the fourth step would be, of course, not necessarily in serial, but you should be doing this in parallel. The fourth step would be to evacuate prisoners in jails and patients in hospitals. They require special types of vehicles. For example, patients in hospitals, many of the patients in hospitals may require ambulances. Some may be able to get onto a regular bus, but many may require ambulances. So you'll have to procure the required number of ambulances. Now, prisoners in jails will need special police vehicles with armed guards, otherwise they will escape. So this part is a little bit complicated, but you'll have to do this on the side in parallel. You'll have to mobilize special vehicles for evacuating these 2 types of categories. So if you give an answer like this, it will impress the examiner because it will show that you have thought the problem through and you have come up with many innovative solutions.
If a sinister-looking man carrying an axe knocked on your door and asked you where your best friend was, would it be morally acceptable to tell a lie? Immanuel Kant, surprisingly, thought it wouldn't. The example of the would-be murderer is his. Tell the truth is what Kant called a categorical imperative, an absolute duty, one without exceptions. It applies to everyone, whatever the consequences. In fact, Kant argued that if you told a lie which, by chance, led to the axeman finding your friend, that would be on your conscience. So if you tell the axeman that your friend is not in the house when he is, and your friend then sneaks out the back door and bumps into the axeman, anything that then happens is, to some extent, your responsibility. But if you told the truth, then the consequences for your friend, no matter how grisly, should not be on your conscience. This brings out how different his moral stance was from utilitarianism, the philosophy that you should do whatever brings about the greatest happiness. A utilitarian would think about the consequences of telling the truth or of lying. In contrast, for Kant, some actions were just wrong, even if good consequences might flow from them. This is known as a deontological approach to ethics.
Immanuel Kant was a famous German philosopher, and I don't know how many of you agree with the video that you saw just now. Kant said that there are certain virtues which are categorical imperatives. That is, you must always follow them. Speaking the truth, according to Kant, was one such virtue. You must always tell the truth, come what may, irrespective of the consequences. Now, not all of us agree with Kant in this matter. Supposing I am visiting a friend of mine who is terminally ill and who is in a hospital. The doctors and his relatives tell me that he may not live for another 5 days. Now, I can't obviously tell my friend the blunt truth. Dude, I'm told you are going to pop off in 5 days. I can't tell him that. Instead, I'll tell him a white lie. I'll say, you're looking good. I'm sure you will pull through. That's what we all do. So we all think that there are certain situations in which truth-telling may be inappropriate. This is again a case of ethical dilemma. Usually, these inappropriate cases are where one virtue clashes with another. Telling the truth is a virtue, and not causing hurt to a dying man is also a virtue. So now you have to choose between the two. Now I would think that not causing hurt to a dying man by telling him a white lie is a greater virtue. So I'll tell a lie in this situation. I'll tell him you're looking good. I'm sure you will pull through. Now you may remember in the Mahabharata, there's a famous story of Yudhishthira and Ashwatthama. Yudhishthira or Dharmaraja was known for always telling the truth. He never told a lie. Now in the Mahabharata war, Dronacharya was proved to be simply too much for the Pandavas, and there was no way they could defeat him. So Lord Krishna said, the only way you can defeat Dronacharya is if you tell him that his son Ashwatthama is dead. On hearing that sad news, Dronacharya will lay down arms, and he will, only then you will be able to defeat him. Now, Dronacharya is not going to believe everybody if they say that Ashwatthama is dead. So they arrange Yudhishthira to tell that lie. Now Yudhishthira, being a very honest person, he says, no, I can't tell a lie. So then they arrange a via media. There's an elephant called Ashwatthama, which they kill, and they tell Yudhishthira to say, if Dronacharya asks you, is Ashwatthama really dead? You say yes. Don't say that it is Ashwatthama the elephant. Just say Ashwatthama is dead. So they spread the word that Ashwatthama is dead, and Dronacharya becomes very upset. He doesn't trust anybody else, so he asks Yudhishthira, is Ashwatthama really dead? And Yudhishthira, much against his will, he tells a white lie or a half-truth. He says yes. And believing Yudhishthira, Dronacharya lays down arms, and then the Pandavas go on to win the war. Now, this story tells you that there are some situations in which telling a lie may be necessary and may be preferable. Of course, that doesn't mean you can lie indiscriminately. It only means that there may be situations where you can't be brutally frank. You may have to take some slight liberties with the truth. The next case study that we'll be discussing is somewhat similar to this video. I will now move on to solving case study question number 12 in General Studies paper 4 of the 2017 mains examination. This is somewhat similar to the video you saw just now in the sense that in both cases the underlying theme is whether you should always tell the truth or
telling a lie is justified in some situations. Let me read out the gist of this case study from the slide. You are the sole eyewitness to a traffic accident caused by the manager of a company with which you have major business dealings, and in which a motorcyclist has been killed. Your honest account of the incident could lead to prosecution of the manager and jeopardize your deal. What will be your response? In a real life situation, your first impulse would probably be to lie to the policeman and say that the purchase manager is innocent and the mistake is entirely that of the motorcyclist. But can you give such an answer in an examination? It all depends on how you justify your stance. Now, Albert Einstein showed that there are no absolutes in the physical universe and that even space and time are relative. In the same way, I would argue that there are no absolutes in the moral universe and that all virtues are relative. While truth-telling is normally a virtue, it is not an absolute virtue. It is not a categorical imperative as philosopher Immanuel Kant called it. That is something which brooks no exceptions. In my opinion, there may be some situations in which truth-telling may not be a desirable thing because it conflicts with another greater virtue. In other words, you should normally tell the truth. Telling lies is bad, but if truth-telling conflicts with another greater virtue, then perhaps lying may be the only option. Let me give an example. Suppose that in this case study, instead of the purchase manager of the company, who is said to be very important to your company's prospects, suppose that your father was driving the car and was involved in the traffic accident, killing a motorcyclist. If the policeman questions you about the accident, will you tell him the truth, saying, yes, my father did it? Most certainly you will not. Why? Because loyalty to your father and safeguarding his liberty is also a virtue. Now the question arises, which is the greater virtue, telling the truth or safeguarding your father's liberty? For almost everyone, I would suppose that loyalty to one's father and safeguarding his liberty is, relatively speaking, a greater virtue than telling the truth to the policeman. The same logic would hold good if your brother, spouse, or a very dear friend was driving the car involved in the accident. In other words, it depends upon the nature and depth of your relationship with the other person. The key term here is the nature and depth of your relationship with the other person. In this case study, maintaining good relationship with the purchase manager and his company are very important to your company. You are negotiating a big deal and the purchase manager has been good enough to offer to drop you in your hotel in his car after dinner. If you tell the truth to the police and the purchase manager gets prosecuted and goes to jail, the relationship between your company and the purchase manager's company may get permanently jeopardized. Your company may lose out on a very big order. Your own relationship with the purchase manager will also be permanently ruined. The jobs of many of the employees in your company may be endangered. There is a possibility that your company may fire you. When you weigh the virtue of telling the truth against the conflicting virtues of preserving good relations between the two companies, preserving the good relationship between you and the purchase manager, and protecting your job as well as the jobs of your colleagues, it would seem to me that telling the truth is, relatively speaking, the lesser virtue in this case. So you have four options in this case. The first option is to tell the plain truth. From what we have discussed so far, this is not desirable. The second option is to tell a blatant lie that the motorcyclist was at fault. Your conscience may not permit you to lie so unabashedly. The third option is to tell the policeman a white lie or a wishy-washy statement that you had dozed off in the car and didn't see how the accident occurred, and that you woke up only after the accident happened. This way you may not be openly supporting the purchase manager, but you will not hurt him either, and he will understand. The fourth option is to pass the buck back to the policeman, saying that he should perhaps ask other eyewitnesses or see the CCTV footages to see what happened. The question says that you are the sole eyewitness to the accident, but you may not know it at the time. In any case, it is the policeman's duty to conduct proper investigation and find out who is the guilty party. A combination of options 3 and 4 would seem to be the best answer. You tell the policeman that you had dozed off in the car and didn't see what happened and woke up only after the accident. You also suggest to him that he should perhaps inquire with other witnesses and verify the CCTV footages of the accident. So, while truth telling is a virtue, in this case, it is more than offset by the rival virtues of preserving good relationships and the jobs of your colleagues and yourself. So, you may have to tell a small white lie to save the purchase manager with whom you have a very deep relationship. Remember, there is no one correct answer to a case studies question. It is how you argue your stance and how innovative your solutions are that will impress the examiner.
There are 4 options. Option 1 is to tell the blunt truth. Yes, the purchase manager did it, which will spoil your relationship with the purchase manager, spoil the relationship of your company with his company, make your company lose out on the big orders. Perhaps you may lose your job, and a number of your colleagues may also lose their jobs because your company may go under if its relationship with this big company, purchase manager's company, is jeopardized. Option 1 may not be in order. Option 2 is to tell a blatant lie that it is not the purchase manager but the other person who was responsible for the accident, which is not the case, and your conscience may not permit you to tell such a blatant lie. Option 3 is to tell what is not exactly the truth, but at the same time will not hurt the purchase manager. You can tell the policeman, I was dozed off, I didn't see what happened, I woke up after the accident, I'm sorry, I can't help you in this matter. And option 4 is what I may call passing the buck. Though the question paper says that you are the sole eyewitness to the accident, of course you don't know that, so you can tell the policeman, I'm sure there are other eyewitnesses to the accident, why don't you ask them? Or why don't you look at the CCTV footage? They can tell you what really happened. So you're basically passing the buck. And if you give this answer, the purchase manager will not be upset. Now, in an ethical dilemma, you have to balance one virtue against another. Telling the truth is no doubt a virtue, but should you tell the truth at the cost of losing your job, making a number of your colleagues lose their jobs, making your company lose big orders, and sending this purchase manager to jail? Now, let me put it this way. Supposing instead of the purchase manager, your father was driving the car and this accident happened. Would you tell the truth, blunt truth, and tell the policeman, yes, it was my father who caused the accident? Most probably, no. You will say, I didn't see. So, whatever logic applies to your father should also apply to the purchase manager in this case, because the relationship, whether you tell the truth or lie in a particular case, or a semi-lie in a particular, depends on the nature of the relationship. Some relationships are so important, like the relationship between father and son, husband and wife, or brother and sister, or whatever. You may have to tell a small lie, or you may not have to tell the blunt truth. So I would therefore say that a combination of options 3 and 4, that you had dozed off and you didn't see what really happened, and the policeman had better inquire with other eyewitnesses if available and look at the CCTV footage, would be the best possible answer.
If you were walking past a shallow pond and heard a toddler struggling in the water, would you ignore the child's cries? No, of course not. You'd jump in and save her, even if you'd ruin your shoes in the process. You'd do it even if your shoes cost £100. That's a small price to pay. Yet, if you gave £100 to the right charity, you could save a child's life that way too. There are children abroad dying every day from curable diseases, from starvation, from contaminated drinking water. Globally, nearly 10 million children under 5 die each year from poverty-related causes. If you'd ruin your £100 shoes to save one life, you should be prepared to donate at least as much to saving another. Or is there perhaps an important difference between a child drowning in front of you and one dying in a far-off land? The philosopher Peter Singer thinks not. He acknowledges that we have biases that lead us to favor those near us over those farther away, but he argues these are irrational. He believes we in the richer country should be more generous to those in tougher circumstances. A child dying 5,000 miles away is as real and as in need of help as the child drowning in the pond just around the corner.
This video is based on a famous article by the philosopher Peter Singer, written in 1971. Peter Singer, you will recall, is the author of the book Ethics in the Real World, which I had recommended earlier. What Peter Singer says is, it doesn't matter whether a child is dying right in front of your eyes or 2,000 kilometers away in Somalia or Afghanistan or Cambodia. You have a moral duty to save the child if you can do it. And it really doesn't cost much to save children. What happens in real life is that everybody thinks, why should I do the saving? Why can't others do the saving? There are people who are richer than me. There are countries which are richer than us, than ours. Why can't they help? Now, if you think like that, then finally nobody will help. In the child drowning case, for example, you are the only person, and so you jumped in immediately and helped. If there are other people also, then it is quite likely that you would not have jumped in so readily. You might have waited for somebody else to jump, and each person would think the same way, and finally nobody would have jumped in and the child may have actually drowned. Now, this is not an outlandish example. Things like this are happening all the time. Supposing you are walking along Anna Salai and you happen to see a ghastly traffic accident. A person is seriously injured and has to be rushed to the hospital. You have the initial impulse to help him, but then you realize that you may get embroiled in a police case or a court case. So you hold yourself back. All the other passers-by and other motorists also think the same way, and then nobody will go to the rescue of the injured person. What Peter Singer says is that number one, you should not wait for others. If something bad is happening, you should jump in to help. And two, whether the thing is happening right in front of your eyes or happening 2,000 kilometers away, it doesn't matter. The moral principle involved is the same. If you are in a position through a small contribution to save the life of a child, whether in your own hometown or in Somalia or in Afghanistan or in Cambodia, you should do it. His article and that video was basically a plea for greater contributions to charity, for greater donations to NGOs which are engaged in child welfare, and for greater foreign aid from richer countries to poorer countries. Let us now solve another case study question. This is question number 10 in General Studies paper 4 of 2017 mains examination. This is somewhat similar to the video you saw just now, in the sense that in both cases, the underlying theme is whether you should jump in to rescue a dying person, even when there are other persons around who can help, or even when you have very pressing matters to attend to. I hope you now realize why I asked you to see
all the 50 videos of BBC Radio 4 and Open University UK. Even if at first glance the videos may not seem relevant. Each of these videos explains a particular philosophical viewpoint, and you can never know in advance when a case study question involving one of these philosophical viewpoints will be asked in General Studies paper 4. After all, each video is of only 1 to 2 minutes duration, and you will spend less than 2 hours watching all 50 of them. Now, you have put in an enormous amount of study. You passed the prelims examination, you passed the mains examination, and you have been called for personal interview. On the date of the interview, on your way to UPSC, you notice that a woman and child who are your relatives are badly injured in a traffic accident. They need immediate help. What will you do? You must use your imagination and think of various alternative options. The first option is that since you have put in so much hard work to get to the interview stage, you cannot afford to be distracted by this accident and miss your all-important IAS interview. You hope that one of the passers-by will help them and you proceed straight to the interview. But if every passer-by thinks like you, then it is quite possible that nobody will help the injured woman and child. Of course, you can call up her husband or other close relative and request them to rush to the spot. But even this is not enough. This option will show you as an unsympathetic and self-centered person who doesn't value human lives. Even if the woman and child are not your relatives, as Peter Singer said, you have a moral duty to jump in and help them and not pass the buck to others. The second option is to attend to the woman and child, take them to a hospital and stay with them till the hospital admission formalities are over, or till the woman's husband or any other relative comes to relieve you, even if in the process you miss your IAS interview. Now, this may show you as a very humane person and a good Samaritan, but missing your IAS interview altogether would be foolish. The third option is to call for an ambulance by dialing 108, wait till the ambulance arrives, and then proceed to the interview. But you don't know how long the ambulance will take to come, and there is a risk of it getting delayed and of your missing the IAS interview. Moreover, it is not enough if you simply put them on an ambulance. Somebody needs to accompany them and complete the admission formalities in the hospital. While this third option is better than the other two, it is still unsatisfactory. The fourth option is to call up somebody in the UPSC, perhaps the PRO or the undersecretary in charge of interviews, explain the facts of the accident, and request that your IAS interview may please be rescheduled. If it is in the forenoon, can it be rescheduled to the afternoon? If it is in the afternoon, can it be rescheduled to the forenoon of the next day, or at least as the last interview of this day? If your request is agreed to, then you can accompany the injured woman and child to the hospital and complete the admission formalities and be with them until her husband or some other relative comes there. But in reality, you may not be able to get through to anybody proper in the UPSC, and even if you do, he may not be able to give you a firm assurance that your interview will be rescheduled. He may say something like, I'll have to ask the chairman or the concerned member, and then he may or may not get back to you. So while there is no harm in exploring this option, it is fraught with risk. Most candidates attending the IAS interview usually take a companion or escort along with them up to the UPSC gates. This companion may be a parent or a relative or a friend for moral support and for physical assistance, if any, required en route. In fact, I would strongly recommend that you don't proceed to the IAS interview alone, but take a companion with you. Now, if you have a companion with you, then you can call for an ambulance by dialing 108 and request your companion to wait at the spot till the ambulance arrives while you proceed to the IAS interview. You also request your companion to accompany the injured woman and child to the hospital, complete the admission formalities, and be with them until her husband or some other relative comes there. After your IAS interview is over, you proceed to the hospital and look up the woman and the child. This option enables you to do both things, help the woman and the child, and also attend the IAS interview. The best answers could be a composite of options 3, 4, and 5. That is, you call for an ambulance by dialing 108. You also call up UPSC and tell them about the accident and say that while you will in all probability make it to the interview in time, just in case there is any delay, your interview may be slotted as the last interview for the session. Then you request your companion or escort to wait for the ambulance and take the woman and the child to the hospital and complete the admission formalities and be with them until her husband or some other relative comes there.
So if I may summarize, option 1 of ignoring the traffic accident and proceeding straight to the interview is not in order. It shows you as cruel and unsympathetic. Option 2 of missing the IAS interview altogether and attending to only the woman and the child and admitting them in the hospital and doing other things may make you look good, but then you can't afford to miss the IAS interview. That would be foolish. Option 3 is to call for an ambulance, wait till the ambulance comes and put them on the ambulance and then proceed for the interview. But you don't know how long the ambulance will take, and somebody has to be there to do the admission formalities in the hospital, and the woman and child need some support. So this is an option 4 is that you ring up UPSC and ask them to reschedule the interview if you're from morning to afternoon or from afternoon to the next day, but you may not get a clear reply and you will risk missing the interview altogether. But there's no harm in trying. Option 5 is you will be taking an escort with you, not just for this reason, not because a traffic accident may happen on the road, even otherwise for moral support and physical support. You won't be going alone, you will be taking an escort with you, and you will call for an 108 ambulance, ask your friend to wait till the ambulance comes, and then take them in the ambulance to the hospital, admit them, and in the meantime you proceed to the interview, complete your interview, and then you go and look them up in the hospital. So the best answer maybe would be a combination of 3, 4, 5. That is, you call for the ambulance. You also, in the meantime, ring up UPSC and tell them that while you will come on time, by chance you are delayed, they should reschedule the interview. But you tell them, in all probability, I will come on time. But just in case I am delayed, I would like you to know this is the reason why I am delayed. And you will ask your friend, relative who is the escort, to take the child and the mother to the hospital, admit them there, and then you will say that you will, after finishing the interview, you will go and look them up in the hospital. This would be the best possible answer. Remember again, there's no one correct answer. How you argue your case is what matters.
Morality demands that individuals' acts or states of affairs that are the same should be treated the same. But we don't always do that. Discrimination is the favoring of one group or member of a group over another group or other member of it in the absence of any morally relevant differences. Morally relevant differences are things that would actually justify unequal treatment. Like if you work for an airline and you're hiring a pilot, you can favor a person with sight over a blind person because when the job is flying a plane, sight matters. You're not discriminating against a blind person because they're blind, but because they are literally unable to do the job. And someone who looks like me would be a fairly awful candidate to go undercover with, like, the Haitian Mafia, which means skin color can matter, although very rarely. So there are cases where we can see clear justifications for favoring members of one group over another, and there are plenty of equally obvious cases where favoritism seems clearly unjustified. But what about the not so clear-cut cases? What if there really are reasons you might want to discriminate, but those reasons are relevant in one instance and not another? So let's look at some tough cases. Contemporary American philosopher Peter Singer offers the example of a restaurant owner who doesn't want to hire an African American because his clientele is racist. He's afraid that many of his customers will stop coming to his restaurant rather than be served by an African American. So the restaurant owner himself doesn't hold racist beliefs, but he worries the decision to be colorblind in hiring will harm his livelihood. It might make us uncomfortable to admit, but in certain parts of the country, this restaurant owner's concerns are not at all unfounded. unfounded. Or consider a woman who refuses to be treated by a highly qualified gynecologist simply because he's male. Now, what about a woman who refuses to be treated by a qualified gynecologist because he's Asian American? American philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson offers this rule of thumb: discrimination that favors a historically underprivileged class is more likely to be acceptable than discrimination that favors a historically privileged class. The reasoning, she says, is that those who have historically been denied privilege could use the advantage. So if a woman is getting hired over a man, well, that's not a big deal, considering that men have been hired over women so many times in the past. As long as a historically underprivileged group continues to suffer from the disadvantages of the past, even if those disadvantages are not currently being imposed on them, Jarvis Thomson says a little special treatment is okay.
The video you saw just now is a condensed version of a video on discrimination from the Crash Course in Philosophy website. Discrimination exists in various forms. People may be discriminated on the basis of gender, on the basis of caste, on the basis of religion, on the basis of sexual preference, on the basis of race, and on the basis of region. Our Constitution says that people are equal before law and enjoy the equal protection of laws. But in practice, we know that many people are discriminated against on one ground or the other. Recently, there was a news item about a Dalit village panchayat president in one of the villages in Kadalur district being made to sit on the floor while the village panchayat meeting was in progress, while the rest of the members sat around a table. Similar instances were reported in 2006 when I was the Secretary Rural Development and Panchayat Raj of the Government of Tamil Nadu. I remember instructing the district collectors to make a list of all village panchayat presidents who are Dalits, call them and ask them whether they're being subjected to any such discrimination or ill treatment. And if indeed they are being treated badly, then to summon the vice presidents and other members of those village panchayats and give them a stern warning, including the threat of proceeding against them under the SC/ST Atrocities Act. I had also instructed the BDOs to visit these village panchayats by surprise and attend the panchayat meetings as observers to see whether the Dalit panchayat presidents are being treated honorably. Now, it's a shame that so many years after the Constitution came into force, such instances of discrimination are happening even now, and even in a progressive state like Tamil Nadu. So we have to recognize that discrimination is a fact, and that merely professing equality before law is not going to change the situation on ground. It's not going to change the mindset of certain people. The video talked about discrimination in the US context, and the video also said that reservations or affirmative action is justified in those cases where a section of the people have been subjected to discrimination for a long time, and some amount of reservation is necessary to bring them up to the level of the others and to provide a level playing field. That's a separate topic altogether, but remember this: equality, discrimination, reservations, these are all highly emotive topics, and case studies from one of these topics are very likely. I don't think any question has been asked till now except one. But such case studies are quite likely.
Our fourth example is case study question number 10 in General Studies paper 4 in the 2015 mains examination. This is a case study relating to discrimination of the kind discussed in the Crash Course in Philosophy video you saw a little while ago. As I said in respect of the BBC Radio 4 plus Open University UK videos, please make it a point to see all the 46 videos of Crash Course in Philosophy, even if some of them seem to be irrelevant at first glance. Each of these videos explains a particular philosophical viewpoint, and you can never know in advance when a case study question involving any one of these philosophical viewpoints will be asked in General Studies Paper 4. For example, you may get case study questions on topics like abortion, euthanasia, identity theft, artificial intelligence, vaccination scares, pseudoscience, poverty, freedom versus security, freedom versus privacy, civil disobedience, and so on. Watching the 46 videos in the Crash Course in Philosophy website will help you answer all such questions. It will also train your mind to think differently and perceive issues in a new light. Let me now read out the gist of this case study from the slide. School boycott by caste Hindus due to appointment of Dalit cook for noon meal center. Drastic drop in attendance could lead to discontinuation of the noon meal scheme and possible closure of the school. As president of the Panchayat, how will you overcome the conflict? What are the responsibilities of different social segments and agencies to create a positive social ambience? Now, an incident like this actually happened in Tamil Nadu a few years ago, and there was a lot of controversy over it. As president of the village panchayat, you would ideally like to settle the issue amicably at your level. The first option, of course, is to request the district collector to transfer the Dalit cook of the noon meal center to some other village panchayat so that your problem is solved. But in all probability, the collector will negative your request because it sets a bad example. It will amount to rewarding the caste Hindus who organized the unjust boycott, and it may lead to a similar boycott by the caste Hindus of the other village panchayat to which the Dalit cook is transferred. So while your problem is solved, the collector's problem isn't. There cannot be any compromise with unjust caste discrimination of this kind. The second option is to ignore the boycott by caste Hindus and proceed the business as usual attitude and not make any efforts to resolve the problem. This would not only be confrontationist but would allow the problem to fester. So it is not advisable. You must reach out to the caste Hindus and try to persuade them to withdraw their unjust and retrograde boycott call. Now, it is easy to preach but difficult to practice what one preaches. Your third option is to set an example by organizing a community feast cooked by the Dalit cook in which all progressive members of the village participate. This sends a message to the caste Hindus effectively that if the panchayat president and so many other villagers can partake the food cooked by the Dalit cook, why can't the children of the caste Hindus do the same? In Tamil Nadu, the government has a very progressive event called Samabandhi Bhojanam, in which a district collector participates in a community feast in which representatives of all castes are present on Independence Day and Republic Day. This is done to break down caste barriers against interdining. The community feast organized by you will serve the same purpose. The fourth option is to bring the matter to the notice of the sub-collector and the district collector, who can take legal action against the caste Hindus under the SC and ST Atrocities Act 1989. They may first warn the caste Hindus, and then if they still don't heed the warning, they may follow it up with legal action. But threats of prosecution are usually counterproductive, and this should be the last resort only if everything else fails. The fifth option is to requisition the services of an influencer or an authority figure who can effectively persuade the caste Hindus to withdraw the unjust boycott call because he or she is held in high esteem by them. Now, as you know, each individual or group has an influencer or authority figure to whose words the individual or the group will usually listen. For a child, it may be the father or the mother or a grandparent. For a group like this, it may be the local MLA or MP or some other political leader or a guru or a swami or some member of the community who is held in high regard. As president, you can identify the influencer or authority to whose advice the caste Hindus will listen and persuade him to resolve the deadlock. The best answer would be a composite one involving some element of each of these 5 options. That is, no transfer of the Dalit cook out of the village panchayat. You will reach out to the caste Hindus and try to persuade them. You will set an example by organizing and participating in a community feast in which the food is cooked by the Dalit cook and several progressive villages participate. You will inform the sub-collector and the district collector about the problem and tell them that while you will try your best to sort out the problem at your level, you may need their support to take legal action if all else fails. You identify the influencer or authority figure whose words are listened to with respect by the caste Hindus and request him to use his good influence to resolve the problem.
To summarize, there are 5 options. Transferring the Dalit cook to some other noon meal center, not acceptable. 2, adopting a confrontational approach with the caste Hindus, not advisable. Better to reach out, better to hold negotiations and try to persuade them to withdraw their boycott. 3, practice what you preach. Set an example by organizing a community feast at the village level in which you and other influential members of the village belonging to different castes eat the food cooked by this Dalit cook, and thereby setting an example and telling the caste Hindus that if we can do this, what's the problem with your children eating the food cooked by this Dalit cook? 4, escalate the matter to the sub-collector and the collector, who can possibly sound a warning and hold out a threat of legal action. But as I said, threats don't always work and they should be used as the last resort. The 5th option is to find some influential authority figure whose words are listened to with respect by these caste Hindus. If he or she puts in a word, perhaps they will listen. So a combination of all these options may be necessary. 1, the Dalit cook should not be transferred. 2, the president should hold conciliation meetings. 3, the president should set an example. 4, the president should keep the sub-collector and the collector in the loop for their intervention if necessary. And 5, the president should seek the help of or the intervention of an influential authority figure.
A just society has fair laws. But most societies aren't like that. So what can you do? The opponent of slavery, Henry David Thoreau, gave one answer in his essay On Civil Disobedience. Follow your conscience and break the law on moral grounds rather than be a cog in an unjust system. As he put it, let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. Influenced by Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi championed non-violent civil disobedience, or satyagraha, in his campaign for Indian independence. In 1930, he organized a long march to the sea. By picking up a few crystals of salt from the mud, he defied a British law forbidding Indians from making their own salt, inspiring thousands. On a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. She, too, was arrested. Her symbolic act of defiance helped focus the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr., another fan of Thoreau's essay, staged major protests against unjust laws affecting America's black community. Laws that were eventually changed as a result. More recently, climate change protesters and the Occupy movement have taken on the fight for justice through non-violent law-breaking. It's clear that civil disobedience isn't going to go away. There will always be laws that are thought to be unjust in every society across the globe.
This was the fifth and the last video, and I'm sure you will agree with me that the short videos from BBC Radio 4 and Open University and the crash course in philosophy are not only very interesting, but they're also very useful for your preparation for the case studies questions in the civil services examination. As I had mentioned before, you must make it a point to see all the 50 short videos of BBC Radio 4 and the Open University and all the 46 short videos of crash course in philosophy. Even if you think some of them are not relevant, please make it a point to see all of them, because you really don't know which is relevant and which is not. A question can come from any one of the ideas explained in any one of these videos. All of us agree that laws, rules, norms, mores, customs are necessary for the smooth functioning of government, society, institutions, and families. But what if the laws and norms and mores are unjust? Now, this can happen quite often. When the British were ruling India, many of the laws passed by them were unjust, which made Mahatma Gandhi take up protest against these unjust laws, but he did it without resorting to violence. The notion of civil disobedience was first put forward by Henry David Thoreau, the American philosopher, but Mahatma Gandhi was its most famous exponent. Martin Luther King Jr. in USA adopted Mahatma Gandhi's technique to protest against the racial laws in the USA, and like Mahatma Gandhi, he also suffered by going against the government. Gandhiji, as you know, spent almost 12 years in jail, and Martin Luther King was verbally and physically abused on many occasions and also assassinated. Now, it requires a great deal of courage, moral courage and physical courage, to protest against unjust laws, rules, and mores. Not everybody has the moral stature or the courage of a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King. But in your own small way, you can do it, and quite often you will be called upon to do it. In the process, you may suffer, and the question is, will you suffer the unjust law, the unjust custom, the unjust rule, the unjust norm, or will you fight against it? Sometimes you may have to fight against an unjust law or a rule or an incident by being a whistleblower. That is, something wrong may be going on in your company or your organization or in the government, and you as an employee may be in the know of it. Now, if you go public, you may be violating the Official Secrets Act, and in the private sector, you may be violating the non-disclosure agreement, and you may come to grief. But sometimes you may feel so strongly about something that you may still go public. And this is called whistleblowing. Let me give an example. Let us say that you are working in the Kalpakkam Atomic Research Center, and there is radiation leakage which is likely to harm the people of Chennai city. Now, you tell the head of the Atomic Research Center that this must be brought to the notice of the public of Chennai and they should be evacuated immediately. Now, he tells you, no, just keep quiet. Let us quietly sort it out. Now, you may do one of two things. You may keep quiet. You may say that, okay, let me see what happens. Or you may go public. You may say there is a radiation leakage and the authorities are suppressing it. Of course, what will happen then is the full might of the authorities will come against you. You may get suspended, you may get dismissed, or you may even get prosecuted. This is what usually happens to whistleblowers. So whistleblowing is a particular category of disobeying or resisting unjust laws or exposing wrongful event.
We now move on to our fifth and last example. This is question number 12 from the General Studies paper 4 of the 2018 mains examination. This is a case study based on a current affairs topic. Studying current affairs diligently is important not only for the rest of the General Studies papers but also for the case studies questions, because quite a few of them were based on some topic that was prominent or controversial a few months before the mains examination. Let me read out the gist of this case study from the slide. Edward Snowden, ex-CIA systems administrator, leaked confidential government documents to the press about the existence of US government surveillance programs. Though he broke the law, Snowden argued that he had a moral obligation to blow the whistle and warn the public about the government's violation of their privacy. Were his actions morally justified, even if legally prohibited? This case study question comes under the whistleblowers category. The term whistleblowing refers to the process by which insiders go public with their claims of malpractices by or within organizations. They do this usually after failing to remedy the matters from inside. Under normal circumstances, an organization is entitled to total loyalty and confidentiality from its employees. But as you know, every rule has an exception. There may be special circumstances when there are serious malpractices are being committed by organization or are being done by some people within the organization. And this may be putting people's lives at stake or be injurious to public revenue or for any other reason. For example, there may be toxic leaks from a chemical factory which may be endangering public health and the lives of the people. There may be non-adherence to flight safety standards by an airline which may be endangering the lives of passengers. There may be corruption and fraud in defense procurement, which is prejudicial to public revenue. There may be deaths in encounters of innocent persons by the police, or there may be creative accounting and false declarations by a publicly traded company, which may be misleading the investors. Or there may be cheating and plagiarism in scientific research by a professor or some other senior faculty member or scientist in a university or a research institution. Now, in all these circumstances, I hope you will agree that the overriding public interest lies in protecting the public's right to be told, even if in the process the whistleblower has to violate the rule of confidentiality. Only insiders have full and correct information about what mischief is going on in an organization. Outsiders usually have a hazy idea. Without whistleblowers, we may not get to learn about problems until it is too late. Whistleblowers are usually very unpopular because they have dared to expose their organization, their boss, or colleagues. The organization usually denies, ignores, or quietly buries the whistleblower's disclosure. Now, as you know, in the government and public sector, there is a legal bar against disclosing information in the form of Official Secrets Act and conduct rules. You can be sentenced to imprisonment up to 14 years for violating the Official Secrets Act. You can be dismissed, demoted, or punished in other ways for violating the conduct rules. In the private sector, employees are usually gagged from disclosing matters to the public by a confidentiality cum non-disclosure agreement, and if you violate this agreement, the company will drag you to court and the court may award damages against you. So whistleblowing is not for the faint of heart. A person needs to be really brave and really committed to a cause to become a whistleblower and to quote the risk that comes with being a whistleblower. Now, if you consider Edward Snowden's case, in 2013, he revealed thousands of classified National Security Agency documents to journalists. These documents showed numerous surveillance programs run by the USA without the knowledge of the US citizens and in cooperation with European governments and telecommunication companies. The US government retaliated by charging Snowden for violation of the Espionage Act of 1917 and theft of government property. It also revoked his passport. Snowden sought asylum in Russia. Snowden's disclosures fueled welcome debates in almost every country around the world about the limits of government surveillance and the balance between national security and individual privacy. Can a government secretly tap the telephones and intercept the emails of its citizens under the guise of threat to national security? What are the checks and balances to ensure that government surveillance is not misused or overdone? Recently, a US court ruled that the mass surveillance program exposed by Snowden was illegal and possibly unconstitutional. Thus, Snowden's stance was vindicated. Snowden had said that he leaked the documents to inform the public as to that which is done in their name and that which is done against them. Though Snowden's stand has been vindicated, he has personally suffered a great deal in the process and he has to live the rest of his life in Russia. It is this willingness to stand up for a principle and quote risk openly that distinguishes whistleblowing from such related practices as in-house criticism, anonymous leaks, and the like. The US government thought that Edward Snowden was a traitor, a crank, and a troublemaker. But many people think that he was a hero, a do-gooder, and a role model. In fact, I find that there are quite a few questions of the whistleblower type, case study questions of the whistleblower type, and this Edward Snowden is a typical example. As I said at several places in my lecture, my detailed explanation of a case study and even my summary may be much longer than 250 words, which is the limit prescribed by UPSC. So I would advise you to note down the key points from my lecture for each case study and practice writing your answer to the case study questions within 250 words.
After you read a case study question, you should try to identify the ethical principle or principles involved in it. Sometimes a case study may involve two ethical principles that are in conflict with each other. This slide shows some ethical principles commonly encountered in the case study's questions. The list is illustrative and not exhaustive. The ethical principles on the left: truth, compassion, helping nature, not causing harm, liberty, equality, keeping promises, law-abiding, morality, are applicable to both civil servants and non-civil servants. While the ethical principles on the right, neutrality, loyalty, anonymity, confidentiality, transparency, integrity, team spirit, procedural compliance, and justice, apply mostly to civil servants. So far you watched 5 short videos and on ethics related topics. We discussed the issues raised in these videos and in the 5 related case studies which were asked in the past year's question papers. I hope that by now you have a fairly good understanding of the techniques for answering case studies questions. Let us look a little closer. How to solve case studies? Use your imagination to generate a large number of alternative options. Remember, we said for divergent thinking, you need imagination. We rarely use our imagination, but in case studies questions, you will have to use your imagination and generate a large number of alternative options. Think of either or, both, neither, intermediate, unusual options. Remember I said that most of us are used only to binary thinking, either or, black, white. But for case studies questions, you need to put on your spectrum thinking cap. You must think in terms not only of either or, but also both, neither, intermediate, and various unusual options. There is no one correct answer to a case study. Several answers are possible. All of us are used to convergent thinking because our school and college educational system has trained us to believe that there is only one correct answer to a question or only one correct solution to a problem. But this is not true in the case of case studies. Various answers are possible and no one answer may be correct. Even the best answer may not be fully satisfactory. How you argue your stance is what matters. You might have seen even with the answers that we gave to the 5 short videos and the case studies questions that followed them, that they were not fully satisfactory. Don't aim at perfection. There's a term for it. It's called satisficing. In real life, satisfactory solutions are good enough. So what the examiner is looking at is not how correct your answer is, because there is no correct answer anyway. What he's looking at is how you argue your stance, and that is what is important. But there are certain clear no's. No escapist solutions, no shirking of responsibility, no extreme or politically incorrect views. Just because I said that there can be a range of answers, it doesn't mean that you can give silly answers, immature answers, stupid answers, or unbalanced answers. When I say there should be no escapist solutions, what I mean is that you can't run away from a problem. In fact, one of the options given in most case studies questions will be that I'll proceed on leave, or I'll seek a transfer. Those kind of escapist solutions are not acceptable. No shirking of responsibility. Shirking of responsibility means passing the buck upward or sideways. In fact, this is a common option in many of the case studies questions, that you will not take the decision yourself, but you will ask your boss as to what to do, or you will pass the buck to a colleague. This is not acceptable. No extreme politically incorrect views. You should come across as a balanced person who is reasonable in his views and whose heart is in the right place. You cannot seem to be, for example, anti-scheduled castes, anti-minorities, anti-poor, anti-women, and things like this. You should come across as a sober, sensible, and balanced individual. Your solutions must be reasonably practical. Just because a range of alternative answers are possible, it doesn't mean that you can suggest some impractical solutions. Your solution must be reasonably practical. You can go beyond the options given in the question and come up with new hybrid or innovative solutions. In the early years, the question itself used to give a set of options. Now, in the recent past, they have stopped giving the options, and you have to think of the options yourself. But even where the question gives a few options, it doesn't mean that you should restrict yourself only to those options. Remember that a case study question is not a multiple choice question. You do not have to confine your answers to one of the options given. In the case of case studies, you are expected to go beyond the options given in the question and come up with new hybrid and innovative solutions. And lastly, read newspapers and magazines regularly. many case studies are based on current affairs. I'm sure even otherwise, you will be reading newspapers and magazines regularly for your general studies papers. You will notice from the case studies question we are going to solve that many of them were actually based on current affairs or on issues that were topical at that time. After you read a case study question, you should try to identify the broad type or category to which the particular case study belongs. Each broad category of cases has a particular method or technique for solving it. As I said in the beginning, once you have mastered these methods, solving case studies questions should be very easy for you. Don't expect the case studies asked in the past year's question papers to be repeated. Repetition happens, but very rarely. So don't try to memorize the answers to the past case studies questions. Instead, study them only for the purpose of identifying the various categories of cases and the techniques for solving them. If you are up to date with your current affairs, and if you have studied all the various cases discussed in Michael Sandel's book and Peter Singer's book, and if you have watched all the cases discussed in the short videos of BBC Radio 4 and the Open University UK and the Crash Course in Philosophy series, then I think you would have covered virtually the entire gamut of case studies. I think you would be well prepared to answer any case study question that may be asked. But in the case of civil services examination, you should learn to expect the unexpected. So don't be surprised if an entirely novel case study question is asked. If so, don't panic, because everybody else is in the same boat as you. Remember that the various techniques that you learned in the past 2 slides and while solving the various case studies questions will stand you in good stead in solving this entirely novel case study also. Broad classification of case studies. Please note that there may be other types of case studies and that a case study may belong to more than one type. After analyzing the various case studies questions asked in the past year's question papers, I noticed that they fall into certain broad categories. These categories are: 1. Ethical dilemmas. The trolley problem, for example, is a classic ethical dilemma. 2. Ends versus means. Ends means goals or objectives. Means are the methods by which you attain those goals or objectives. Attaining your goals is a laudable objective, is a laudable. But can you resort to any means, even shady means, to attain your goals? Certainly not. Passing the examination may be a laudable goal, but cheating or copying as a means to get good marks is not acceptable. You will find many case studies like this. Third category of case studies is what I would call no compromises. Remember the case where a Dalit noon meal cook was posted to a village and the caste Hindus didn't send their children to school because they didn't want them to eat the food cooked by the Dalit noon meal cook. They wanted her to be transferred out of the village. This is a no compromise case study. Such requests cannot be accepted. Similarly, you find a case study where there is a violation of the letter and spirit of a law and a crime is being committed. Then there can be no compromises. Innovative solutions. Sometimes, as I said earlier, the options given in the question may not be adequate. You will have to think beyond those options and come up with some innovative solutions. For example, in that problem about disaster relief and 1 lakh people being stuck in various villages, one innovative solution that we came up with was to mobilize as many vehicles as possible, in fact, more than the required number of vehicles, in order to obviate, to do away with the difficult problem of prioritizing between various categories of people. If you have enough number of vehicles, you don't have to decide whether senior citizens, women and children, VIPs, these people should be given preference or somebody else should come in the second batch. In fact, you can rescue all of them at the same time. Fifth category of case studies is what I call speaking truth to power. You will find several case studies where a senior minister or a secretary asks you to do something illegal. You don't want to do it, not just because it can land you in trouble, but also because you think that it is morally not right. In such cases, you may have to speak truth to power, that is, tell your minister or secretary that you will not do the illegal thing and you are prepared to face the consequence. Another category of case studies is cutting through bureaucratic procedure for greater public good. Procedure is important, but then procedure is not sacred. There may be times when you may have to tweak the bureaucratic procedure a little, simplify it, or fast forward it in order to do greater public good. But at the same time, you should not go to the other extreme. Flouting procedure can land you in trouble. So there is a via media wherein you are not too rule bound and at the same time you are not totally lawless. You can tweak or bend the rules a little bit as long as you're doing it for greater public good.